We are in part 2 of a series we began last week entitled Open Invitation. And ultimately, the premise of this series, if you will, is the idea that an invitation really can be a powerful thing. I want you to think back of some of the recent invitations that maybe you received in life, right? Maybe it was an invitation to just a normal event, right? You got invited to a wedding, you got invited to some party of some sort, a birthday party. Maybe, and students, maybe this was your recent invitation. Somebody invited you to be their Valentine, and you were just like, oh my goodness, this is exciting, but do I need to get them candy? Do I need to get them chocolate? Do I get them flour? Like, I don't know what to do. Like, there's always these invitations that we're like, what do we do? Where do we go? What does this look like? Sometimes they're normal. Sometimes they're bigger than normal. Maybe you recently got an invitation to participate in jury duty. They don't call it an invitation, they call it a summons. I guess it just gives it a little bit more power and more, you've got to do this, unless you find a loophole, and then you're like, I told you so. Maybe you recently got an invitation from the IRS to give them more money, and you're like, I don't want this invitation, I want to put it back, right? Or maybe you got an invitation from the lovely, the most respectable. You got an invitation from your local HOA that pesky trash can has been in your front yard just a little too long, and they would like you to make a minor donation. I don't know what invitations you've gotten, right? Some are good, some invitations are bad. Some invitations are big and some invitations are small, but isn't it true that in many instances we don't know just the nature of the invitation until long after the invitation? We don't know how big this invitation was really going to be. We don't know how big this story is going to be, what the story is going to play out, because in many instances we say yes to an invitation and then years later we realize just how significant it is. I mean, what we talked about last week was this idea that a simple invitation really can change a life. A simple invitation, maybe an imperfect invitation, a small invitation can change a life. And looking back upon invitations, we can see the life-changing events from time to time, right? Maybe as we talked about, it was an invitation to college, and you had no clue what was on the other side of that education. Maybe it was an invitation to a new job. They call it like a job offer, but maybe it was an invitation to a new job, and you just thought, I'm just got to check the box because I've got to pay the bills, and now you've got such great colleagues and friends that you're so grateful for. Maybe you got invited to a meal with some friends, and you just thought it was a gathering or just to grab some coffee, and little did you know that one coffee would turn into multiple coffees. Little did you know that in that group was some special someone that maybe 2-3 coffees later would ask you for another date, and that date became engagement, and now you're expecting, and you're like, wow, that was just a simple coffee that changed the trajectory of my life. I mean, when we look back, we realize that a simple invitation absolutely can be life-changing. An invitation can be so mesmerizing. And what we talked about last week is that's especially true when it comes to our faith. When we begin to think about our story and how we became followers of Jesus, or how we chose to believe and to put our faith into Jesus, we talked about how there is an invitation at that. And ultimately, if you're not a Christian in here, I'm so grateful that you joined us this morning. But one of the things I want you to know, at the center of our faith, the center of what we've chosen to believe, is not a list of rules. It's not a list of do's and don'ts, or a behavior system or a belief system. The center of our faith is about a man who chose to walk the earth, the Son of God, who stepped out of heaven and he walked the face of the earth, and then he gave his life for us. And the invitation that Jesus of Nazareth gave us over 2,000 years ago is the same invitation that we offer on a regular basis. And it's this invitation: would you follow me? I mean, you look through the course of the New Testament, you look through the documents of Jesus, and you realize that every time Jesus interacted with someone, the invitation was, would you follow me? It was an open invitation to anybody, an open invitation to everybody. It was an invitation that Jesus extended to anybody and everybody that he came in contact with. to anybody that would want to take him up on the offer. And as many of you have, we've been able to take Jesus up on the offer, and we've chosen to follow him. We've chosen to place our faith or to place our confidence in Jesus. And at some point after that, isn't it true, we realize, or we begin to think about, that the invitation that Jesus offered us, it wasn't just an invitation for us. That there's something inside of us that we get the chance to share that good news, that we don't want it to just be a benefit to us. We want to share it and allow it to be a benefit to others as well. We realize that it's not just good news for me, and it's not just good news for my family, but it's good news for all. And we realize we have the opportunity, and should I say the responsibility, of sharing and showcasing and inviting others into this conversation. That we get the chance to not just keep it to ourselves, but to share with others of what Jesus has done in our life. And as we looked at last week, the beautiful thing is we get the chance to be a part of what God is doing. That there's no pressure, there's no expectations, that we get to step in and we get to be a part of what God is already doing in and around the world. That we get the chance to allow God to use us to introduce the good news, the hope, the grace that Jesus provides, not just for us, but for everybody. Now, just talking about that can sound a little scary, right? Even just talking about the responsibility that we have of sharing what Jesus has done in our life, sometimes it can make our blood pressure go up, right? It can make it a little bit abnormal. Like, wait a second. Scott, we can talk about anything, the weather, how it has been so cold. Before it was so hot. Before it was so cold. It's just another winter in Texas. We could talk about that all day long. We can talk about how great or how deplorable the Cowboys are, and we could talk about how incredible the Super Bowl was or wasn't. We can talk about a lot of things, but if we're going to talk about our faith, like there's something inside of us that just, it becomes a little daunting. But we looked at last week that the truth is, the reality is we don't have to be Bible experts, which is incredible. We don't have to be really far in our faith. That what God has asked us to do is simply to share, to offer a simple invitation. We don't have to have been someone that's been to church for years and years and years, and we don't even have to have a perfect story, which is so encouraging because, well, y'all are seeing me. Like, we don't have to have a perfect story. But here's what is incredible is we just get the chance to offer a simple invitation. There's no arguing. There's no convincing. There's no need to try to explain. And as we saw last week, Philip and Nathanael, two friends that became followers of Jesus, disciples of Jesus, individuals who chose to follow and were part of this world-changing, life-changing movement that Jesus initiated. Philip and Nathanael were, one day Philip realized who Jesus was, and like a good friend realized, I need to tell Nathanael. He's a good buddy of mine. We've been looking for this Messiah for years and years and years, and I found him. I need to tell my good friend Nathanael. This is not just good news for me. This is good news for all. Nathanael, we've got to do this. And so he goes and he tells Nathanael, and as we talked about last week, Nathanael's response was simple. Can anything good come from Nazareth? To which Philip simply retorted to Nathanael's curiosity, which we don't know exactly what went into Nathanael's question of goodness from Nazareth. But Philip responds and simply says, tell you what, I'm not going to try to convince you. I'm not going to argue with you. You're right. There's some awkwardness down there. But here's what I want you to know. I want you just to come and see. And this right here captures the heartbeat of a great invitation. There's no need to convince or to argue or explain. We just get to invite people to come and see. And one of the things that I challenged you last week was the good news is we don't have to have all the answers, but the challenge that I gave you guys last week was as we gear up and get ready for Easter, I would love for everybody to offer an invitation to somebody. Everybody invite somebody to come and experience North Tarrant Church. That we could all experience what it looks like to invite somebody to show up at North Tarrant Church to invite. Now, I know invitations can be, you can just check the box. I shared it on Facebook. I'm good to go. So I think you guys are remarkable people. So I would love for you guys to all bring someone, not just invite, but what would it look like if we all brought someone to experience North Tarrant Church between now and Easter? That you invite, and you invite them to come and sit with you. You invite them to come and be a part. But if we talked about that last week, it begs the question, right? What makes a good invitation? What makes a good invitation? And said a little differently, maybe it's more this way. What makes an invitation good? Because we live in a world where we don't want it to be weird. Like, if I invite somebody to join me, I don't want it to be the end of a friendship. I don't want it to be one of those things that just goes a little wonky from that point forward. And they're like, oh my goodness, don't talk about church with them, right? Like, what does that look like? And one of the things that we realize is what makes a good invitation, and ultimately a good invitation is often, it's preceded by something. There's something in our life, or there's something that comes first. In fact, I would argue that there's a bunch of things that come first. And today, I want to look at one specific thing that precedes a good invitation, that allows us to have the trust to be able to invite. But to get there, ultimately, what I want to think about is this idea that all of our invitations, they have competition, right? You could imagine, like, if you were to invite somebody to join you, there's competition across the board. You invite a coworker, you invite a neighbor, you invite a classmate, you invite somebody that's in the marching band with you. You invite somebody to join you, and there's competition, right? We live in a busy world. You think about all of the busyness that is going on. From running kids around to work to just trying to keep up with life. And if you don't have anything going on Sunday morning, oftentimes you're thinking, I don't want to have anything on Sunday morning, so don't give me something else to do. But there's something bigger at stake when we begin to look at the competition to an invitation. And that's this word right here, the reputation. Specifically, the church's reputation. Not necessarily our church, not North Tarrant's reputation, well, that does play into it. But when we begin to look at the Big C church, the big church, the church in general, there's a reputation that people have. There's a perception. Whether it's true or not, what we realize is perception is reality. In fact, the church has a reputation with each person we come in contact with each person we invite. For some, it's positive. For some, it's negative. It could be small, it could be big. For many, the reputation they have of the church comes from their upbringing. It comes from the people they engage with. It comes from the people they talk to. It was shaped by a number of different things. The family of origin, right? The church background. Maybe they had a bad church experience at the hands of somebody they trusted. It could be a Christian that maybe treated them the wrong way. It could be a Christian that they then find is in the news, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, wait a second. But for each person, we have an opportunity to invite. Something comes to mind when they think about church, when they think about Jesus, when they think about Christians. And perception, well, like I said, not always true. Perception is reality. Perception is reality, and here's the bad news, unfortunately, when it comes to people in our community, what comes to mind is not always the best of things, right? What comes to mind when people think about church or hear about faith or religion, it's not always the best of things. They tend to have a negative view. They tend to be a little resistant to church or faith. In fact, in 2022, an organization called the Barna Group, they did a research project basically to figure out what when it comes to people who are church averse or who don't really want to have anything to do with church or religion or anything, they began to ask them, like, just positive or negative. I'm going to say a word, you tell me, good or bad, good or bad. And they ended up calling the study, Americans Like Jesus and His Message, but not so much His messengers, because of what they found out. In fact, they interviewed thousands upon thousands of people, and they basically just said, hey, I'm going to give you a word. You tell me if it's positive or negative. One of the words they said is, how about Jesus? Jesus came out 40%. 40% of people had a positive view of Jesus. I mean, 4 out of 10. I mean, that for some of us, we're thinking like, that's not good, but just wait, that's actually pretty good, right? How about churches? You know, when they asked these people, churches came out to be 22%. 1 out of every 5 people have a positive view of church. And then they went on and they decided to ask about pastors. 18% of people had a good view of pastors. I mean, that's less than 1 out of 5, which is not good. They even asked about mega churches, and they said when it comes to mega churches, 9%, less than 10% of people have a positive view. You see, the competition for our invitations is not necessarily the busyness of the schedule, but it's the reputation. It's what people think about. It's how people perceive church. In fact, if you grew up in church and you've been a part of, the church for a long time, you probably remember a time when this was a different reality. In fact, in 1995, and this is hypothetical, I'm just making this up, but imagine in 1995, you tried to invite somebody that wasn't a part of a church to come and join you at church. They might have said something like this: I'm not good enough to go to church. If I darken the doors of church, lightning is going to strike. I wouldn't be caught dead there. You flip the script just a few decades later, and I have heard it said, church, I don't want to go there. Why? I am a good person. The dynamic has shifted. The perception that people have of people in the church, that they're resistant to people like us, which is unfortunate. In fact, there's a book that was written a couple of years ago called Unchristian, where it documented unchurched individuals' perception of what they think the church's reputation is. And here were the words that came to mind when they began to think about Christians: judgmental, insensitive, hypocritical. It's us versus them. And students, I would imagine if you were to take a poll of the people, the students that walk the halls with you, they probably wouldn't even bat an eye and be like, well, yeah, duh. But this is so disappointing, because when we think about what Jesus called us to do, what Jesus invited us to be a part of, how Jesus invited us to follow him, the things Jesus asked us to do should silence the reputation and the critics of the world. And they should see that followers of Jesus, they might be weird and kooky, but there's something different about them, and nothing that's on this list should even come quick to the tongue. Because what Jesus invited us to do was something that was completely countercultural. It was instructions, it was challenges that should silence the doubters. And so today, what I want us to do is I want us to look at one such curiosity, one such story that Jesus shared that should be an inspiration for all of us, a challenge, maybe a little convicting. Because what Jesus talked about today, in fact, this is on the Sermon on the Mount. This is coming from Matthew chapter 5. This is when he rallied everybody together. In fact, I heard the other day that just about every ethics book written in the world today, you could find pieces of the Sermon on the Mount coming right out of it. That when we really want to know what does it look like to treat people the right way, the Sermon on the Mount is the go-to. And this was coming from a Harvard professor. This wasn't coming from some random pastor. A Harvard professor is acknowledging that the Sermon on the Mount is one of the greatest ethics texts that we could ever imagine. So this is what Jesus says. He's looking at the world, he's looking at them, and he says, guys, you are the light of the world. Your responsibility, your opportunity is to shine, to show the world what it looks like to be a follower, to illuminate. Everywhere you go, to be an illumination, to lighten the world, to be bright in a dark world. In fact, he goes on, he says, a town built on a hill cannot be hidden, to which we're like, I mean, that sounds good, but we live in Texas. I don't know what towns are on top of hills. I mean, maybe if I lived in Colorado, I could relate, but in Galilee at the time, in fact, today, if you were to go to the Sea of Galilee, you were to walk around the Sea of Galilee, and you could look up, and you could see little ruins. You could see ruins up in the hills where there were cities and villages. And in this time, they understood that those villages up the way, they were oftentimes places of safety. They were places of help, a beacon of hope. And if you were walking around the Sea of Galilee at dark, if you were by yourself or there were just a few people with you and you were walking around, that they knew this was not where you needed to be, especially at dark. And so if you were walking around the Sea of Galilee, and maybe it's just you or a few other people, and you were to look up and you were to see a light, you would know that that's a place that you can resort to for the night. That's a place of safety. That's a refuge of hope. And so Jesus is looking at them and he says, I want you to be a town that's showcasing this light. I want your life should be an obvious source of goodness in the world. That as you go, what I want you to do, I want you to know, I want you to let your light shine in such a way that you, just like those towns that are up in the hills above the Sea of Galilee, I want you to let your goodness shine. It should be an obvious source of goodness in a dark and hurting world. And Jesus continued. He goes, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. I mean, this makes sense to us today, right? I mean, you have a light bulb that's out, you just go get a new light bulb. I mean, that's what we do. But in this day when there was no electricity, I mean, you had to work hard to be able to provide light. They knew that if you finally got light, it was a really big deal, and you don't cover it up. And you're certainly not going to create light only to hide the light. But you're creating light so that it can illuminate the entire room and so that it can be a beacon of hope for everyone to benefit from it. And so everyone that's listening to Jesus, they're leaning in and they're like, this makes sense. I want my light to look like that. And then Jesus continues, and he says, so let your light shine. In the same way, let your light shine before others. And he continues, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Let them see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Let them see you doing good. Let them experience your light. And when it comes to invitations, when it comes to offering up an invitation, hey, I want you to join me. I want you to join me in this endeavor. The truth about invitations is a good invitation is preceded by something. Ultimately, a good invitation is often preceded by doing good, by following Jesus' direction. I mean, here, if we take this seriously, what Jesus is calling us to do is to let our light shine. If we're no good, if we live a life that's deplorable, and none of y'all are in this boat, but I mean, just thinking through it, right? If we live a life that's deplorable and then we invite somebody to a life of following Jesus, people are going to just sit back and scratch their head and be like, wait a second. You say you do this, but you do something's not computing. You see, we cripple our ability to invite others when we actually don't follow the mandates and the instruction, the teaching of Jesus. We cripple what is available. We cripple the invitation. We cripple the ability to invite. In fact, they may have a reputation of the church. This is good. They may have a reputation of the church in mind, but when they see the way you treat them, you might blow their mind and be like, I thought Christians were this way, but there's something different about you. The way you treat, the way you allow your light to shine, you shine your light in such a way that I want to be a part of that. I mean, the reality is the more they get to see the goodness that you have, the more they see your light shine, the more the reputation the church has will begin to fade into the distance because they see you. I mean, that's why Jesus would say, let your light shine before others so they may see your good deeds and they may glorify your Father in heaven. So students, I want to ask you this question as you go to your small groups. What does it look like? What does it mean to let your light shine before others? I mean, think about it. In the groups that you're in, at the lunch table, when you begin to think about the classroom that you're in, I mean, we begin to think about what current teenagers think about Christians and followers of Jesus. It can be daunting. But you have a chance to let your light shine in such a way that people would see you shine, your classmates, your teachers, your parents, be careful there, your friends. You have a chance to allow your light to shine. So as you go to your small group, I want you to go ahead and begin talking about what does it look like to let your light shine before others. And students, I want you to go talk about this. Now, that doesn't mean that as adults, we're off the hook here. Because I want you to think about what does it look like for you to let your light shine before others. You see, when we begin to think about that, there's a story that happens. But people see your good deeds. And as people see your good deeds, what happens is they begin to trust. And as we talked about, as we've heard me say, trust builds curiosity. Trust builds a new narrative. Trust begins to change the way people think. When people can trust a Christian, it doesn't have to be every Christian, which, thank you. But when people see you, and they see the way you treat others, there's a trust that's built which stirs a curiosity. And a curiosity that allows people to build an opportunity for an invitation to be made when people are like, there's something different about you. The way you treat your wife, that I don't see that around. I mean, imagine if in your workplace, you talk about cooler talk, and I know I work in a church, and like everybody just like floats on clouds at every church I've worked at. It's really not the case, right? But you look at the coffee talk, right? And so oftentimes it's demeaning the spouse that you have, and it's demeaning the people around you. Imagine if you were the one that changed the demeanor of that conversation. If you were the one that rather than constantly feeding into the demeaning conversation, can you believe what they did? What if you began to talk good about? And all of a sudden they're like, there's something different about you. Like, I know life isn't perfect, but there's something different about the way you talk about. You got that ailment, but you have so much hope. How can you continue to walk through life with a smile on your face, knowing what we know about your diagnosis? You see, if we live in a world where people are watching, in fact, the beautiful thing about the world we live in is doing good truly does yield trust. Your life, your light, the way you carry yourself will always precede a good invitation. So if that's the case, and for many of us, me included today, we've got to really begin to ask the question, what are you shining? What are you reflecting? In the world you live, in the spaces you occupy, when it comes to your neighborhood, when it comes to your family, when it comes to your kids, what are you reflecting? What are you shining? If a third party were to drop in and they were to just follow you around and do an audit for the way you talk and the way you spend your money and the way you spend your time, what would they conclude? Would they conclude that you are shining? Would they see that it is obvious to the people around you that you are living out the way that Jesus offered us? That you're selfless, forgiving, filled with grace and mercy, even when things don't go your way? Or would they look at you and be like, man, you say one thing, but I've heard you talk about... You're holding grudges, you're unforgiving, the Jesus I see in the New Testament and in the Sermon on the Mount is not necessarily what I see in you. I thought Jesus said, bless your enemy, but you are doing nothing but cursing the enemy that you have found. You're not blessing, nor are you praying for them. What are you shining? What are you focused on in our world today? You see, when we really begin to get to the bottom of an invitation, it's one thing to get on social media and blast, I love my church, come join me. It's another thing to, go next door neighbor and say, hey, I'd love for you to join me. But in order for an invitation to be valid, there's got to be something that precedes the invitation. And the thing that precedes the invitation is what we do. It's how we act. It's what they see us doing and saying and living. As Jesus would say, I want you to be light in a dark world. I want you to be an obvious source of good. You see, long before we ever invite somebody, a good invitation is always preceded by doing good. So what are you shining? What are you showing the world around you? I mean, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for me. Thank you for allowing me to be in this. But it's a challenge for all of us. As we look at the world we have today and we begin to think, Jesus changed the world once. What would happen if he were to change the world again? And it's beautiful because ultimately it just revolves us saying yes to the circle around us. So what are you shining? What are you reflecting? How are you showing the world what it looks like to follow Jesus? They've got plenty of opportunities. They've got plenty of perceptions. Let's don't feed their perceptions. Let's change the narrative. What would happen if we chose to let our light shine for others so they may see your good deeds and point back to Jesus for everything you do? Would you pray with me? God, we love you, and we thank you so much for the fact that you are a big God. And God, I confess that so oftentimes it is so much easier to just, Father, to just allow the conversation of the day, to allow the tired fits, to allow the frustrations at work, Father, to allow the world we live in to get the best of us. But God, you are our King, and you've invited us into a completely different world, not a world where we get to check a box to get to heaven, but a world where you've invited us to showcase heaven here on earth. For that, we need you. So God, I pray that as we begin to think and reflect upon and think about what does it mean to truly let our light shine, that we would submit our lives to you as our King. And that we would allow you as our King to lead, to guide, and to direct us. And God, I pray that you would allow us to change the way we think so that we would realize and remember, reflect upon the fact that every invitation is preceded by something. So may we not lose that invitation by the way we act today. Give us grace. Give us the courage to do what you've called us to do. God, we surrender our lives to you as our King, knowing, God, you have invited us to an incredible life through following you. We ask all of this in Jesus' name.